This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk Live. I'm Rob Port with you. As North Dakota is setting heat records, I was just reading on Twitter that the city of Minot has broken a heat record that was set in like 1985 or something. We broke it, and we broke it at 10 o'clock this morning. So wow. It's a hot one, and my family's getting ready to. In fact, as soon as I finish up with this interview, we're gonna pack up and go camping for the weekend out in this heat, which I don't know. I'm an Alaskan. I need to be refrigerated. I don't know what we're thinking. We wanted to go last weekend, but it snowed at the campsite last weekend. So I don't know. I don't know what we're doing. It's North Dakota, and we are a land of weather extremes. So
we are that.
Senator Kevin Cramer had a recent interview, and he said something I thought was interesting. He wants to get the smile back, or put the smile back into conservatism. And I've obviously had a lot to say about the direction of conservatism in the Republican Party of late, and I like that idea. I'd like to get the smile back. I'm wondering how we do it. And there's also some other very pertinent and interesting things to talk about. We just had a visit from the EPA administrator for the Biden administration to the state of North Dakota, who had I thought, some pretty encouraging things to say about carbon capture, which is going to be a key towards preserving a lot of our important industries in our state. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But Kevin, first of all, putting the smile back in conservatism, what does that mean?
Well, it's sort of interesting because there was a roll call piece, and roll call does these profiles on members of Congress, and particularly in the Senate. They did it about a year ago for me, of course, and then wanted to update it. And what was fun about the profile was the editor allowed the reporter to do it in a Q&A format. In other words, rather than writing a story, he took my literal responses to his specific questions, and with slight edits just for space and things. He just ran it as a Q&A, so I was grateful for that. And it started by him raising the issue of Ronald Reagan being an influential, conservative in the beginning of my life, or certainly in my political life, because he was the first person I could vote for, and then comparing that to Donald Trump, who's the most recent person I voted for president and have a relationship with, and he's trying to draw this contrast. He did a good job of drawing the contrast, and he said, what is it basically about these two guys that because they're not anything alike. And the reality is, as I said, is they actually are a lot alike in terms of Reagan was certainly probably more conservative than Donald Trump, but he was a happy conservative. He was a joyful conservative, but he also had a populist streak in him. He had a pragmatism about him that allowed him to get a lot of things done. So their personalities were very different. But I said they both share an optimism. And I think that's what's misunderstood a lot of times by people with regard to Donald Trump. His stream of consciousness in this 24-hour news cycle situation where everybody's got a recorder going and a cell phone going and all those things. When he's thinking out loud, it gets him in a lot of trouble sometimes, like it does for me, as you know. And but it doesn't translate, I guess, is my point, to the sort of the happy warrior. I'm I'm nothing if not joyful and optimistic. I happen to think that how you talk to people matters as much sometimes as the words that you use, and so I try to be cognizant of that. But I also understand, the Trump appeal to a lot of people. I just prefer joy over anger, and I just think there are just too many people angry today. And it's not just conservatives, Rob. I mean, whatever the cause is, there's a lot of anger in our politics today.
Well, there is, and I think you're right. I don't want to have a debate about Donald Trump, because I think both you and I have well-established positions, and we're just probably not going to persuade the other. And he's not the president anymore. I'm, very, very concerned about where, the conservative movement's going, and what the influence that the former president is wielding over that. And as far as policy goes, I'm not necessarily against. I mean, we can have that debate, and I didn't agree with everything that the president did, but generally,
Right.
Moving us to some different footings on trade, not abandoning the free trade position, but obviously understanding that we're not just going to free trade China into being a
Right.
better global citizen. That's just at one point we thought it was going to happen. I think it has worked in other situations. It hasn't worked with China. It's time we probably recognize that. So I mean, I'm not against that. But I do want a joyful position. What I'm afraid of is conservatives are so. And maybe it's not just conservatives, but I'm speaking as a conservative, and this is what's got my attention right now. We are so concerned with who's the purest conservative, who's I'm the real conservative and you're a communist, and also a lot of the litmus test. And I'm basing this just on sort of the zeitgeist I get from interacting with a lot of members of the public on a daily basis, through my work is a lot of it is tied up in, do you like Trump or not? And if you don't like Trump, then you don't get to call yourself a conservative anymore. There's a lot of that going on right now. And I don't think that jibes at all with what you're talking about with bringing the smile back to conservatism. That's not smiling at one another. That's we're breaking ourselves into smaller and smaller pieces. That's not helping anybody.
Well, again, it's not just conservatives. That's unfortunately the Democratic side of things as well, and that's why the gap between us is getting larger, and personalities are playing a bigger role than policies. And it's okay that we're challenged every now and then over our policy positions or our historic policy positions. But you and I, as conservatives, of course, we want to keep our own house in order and take advantage of the divide on the Democratic side of things. They have really big division problems in the Democratic Party, and we're not exploiting them to the degree we could because we're not as united as we ought to be.
Because we have our own problems with being divided.
Right.
is the issue.
So it's not a new phenomenon. I do think it's a little more on full display because of, again, 24-hour media, podcasts, the ability to communicate more freely and openly, the fact that the communications forums themselves are part of the controversy, things like, the social media platforms that censor conservatives, but will, put any crazy thing the Ayatollah Khomeini wants to tweet or put on Facebook. But I do think, sort of to what can we do about it? What can I do about it? I do think that one thing that we have to do, and this is the example I try to present, and it's not just an example, it's just who I am. I do think optimism is contagious, just like pessimism is. And we have every reason to be optimistic as conservatives and as faithful people who love our country and love our Constitution and believe that it really does matter. And this is where sometimes, Rob, I get the most frustrated is when somebody will, and I think the article you're talking about, by the way, illustrates this pretty clearly in my view. And that is that when we actually are willing as conservatives or as Trump supporters or as Republicans or whatever it is, the category we're fitting into is, we're willing to sort of set aside those institutions like, the Constitution for this other thing. And the reality is, if you keep the main thing, and by that I mean the Constitution, then you don't have to rely on a person's personality to determine which direction you go. And but again, that is not reserved just for conservatives. That is all across our political spectrum.
I think I've told you this before. I don't want to belong to a political movement that's organized around a person. Not ever.
Right.
I want it to be organized around ideas, like the Constitution, which is a lot of very good ideas. It's interesting what you just said about social media. I mean, because we're spending a lot of time trying to shut each other up too. Liberals are doing it, conservatives are doing it. I think the social media companies rue the day when they decided to make themselves the speech referees. I think they kind of wish they could put some of that toothpaste back in the tube. Because I don't think it's really nefarious. I don't think Jack Dorsey really wants to silence people. I think Jack Dorsey wants to make a lot of money from Twitter. I think he has some of his own ideas, but some of the stuff. Well, we just came through with the lab theory, right? With the coronavirus, where I mean, at one point, if you wrote something on Facebook saying, based on this evidence, I think that the coronavirus probably originated in a lab in a province in China, Facebook would ban you for that, or
Right.
or at least suppress your posts or censor you in
Or
some
put a
way.
disclaimer on somehow. Yeah.
Right, and somehow inhibit your ability to communicate that with the public, which is frightening.
Right.
I mean, to me, it's that in a boardroom somewhere they can make that decision. I mean, that's a scary thing for our society. But a lot of that is being driven, and we could talk about cancel culture, but I think so often we think that the threats to our individual liberties are always going to come from the top. Like there's going to be a dictator or some popular leader who's going to come along and take our rights away. And I think we don't spend enough time thinking how much of a threat populism is to individual rights, right? Because populism is about what's popular, and rights are about a lot of times defending what's unpopular. Popular things don't need protections generally, right? Popular speech, if I want to sit here and talk about baseball or the weather or something, that doesn't need First Amendment protections because people aren't going to be that upset about it. What needs First Amendment protections is if I want to say something that's very critical of something that a lot of people support. So I think a lot of times, like, that's what worries me about this shift towards populism is I think we may be living in the most populist age America's ever seen. And I'm afraid that a lot of the threats to liberty are coming from us. Like we're collectively the problem in a lot of this. Do you share that
So,
view?
yeah, I think you make some really important points because, and I do share that view, Rob, to a great degree, because one of the things that's bothered me so much about whether it's the cancel culture, censorship, it's not so much what's happening at the top, is just how willingly we as people are willing to just accept it. And so to your point about populism, why do we, for example, why do we decide at some point that Anthony Fauci's the only person that knows the truth about all things related to COVID-19 when the guy's been wrong almost every time?
Right.
And it's okay that he's wrong. We're learning this as we go, but we have these whole forms that say, oh, he was wrong again, therefore he's awful. No. Or he's got the degree, so therefore he's always right. No. What happened to our own critical thinking? And that's what I worry about. We're squelching our own critical thinking.
And it comes, I mean, there's an appetite in the public to sort of elevate these figures to a point. I mean, we did it with former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was aside from what I may think about her judicial theories, was a wonderful person. And famously had a very nice friendship with Justice Scalia, who was her polar opposite ideologically and in terms of judicial philosophy. But people turned her into this sort of almost messianic figure. They did it with Anthony Fauci. I would argue that the Trump movement does it with Donald Trump, or at least certain factions of the Trump movement do it with Donald Trump, and that's a dangerous thing. And I think it's a dangerous thing to because there's so many different considerations. I just wrote a column about this, about the sort of the dangers of technocracy, and I think I was doing it in the context of vaping policy, because there was a study that just came out from Yale Public Health talking about the city of San Francisco had put a ban on flavored vape products, and what it actually ended up producing was kids who shouldn't be vaping or smoking, by the way, but kids stopped vaping and started smoking, which, I mean, vaping is not good for you, but it's better for you than smoking. And so the result in terms of public policy was a net loss for public health, I think. Now the technical experts will tell you, well, vaping's bad for you and smoking's bad for you, so you shouldn't do either, and we shouldn't have these flavors. And that all makes a lot of sense from a technical aspect. But from a political point of view, right, the reality of how humans actually behave, it didn't make any sense to ban flavored vaping, because we just push kids back to a more unhealthy. So I think there's a lesson to learn from that, where we have technical experts that say these things, but there's a lot of, we had that debate right here in North Dakota where Governor Burgum had problems with his state health officers during the pandemic, where he went through a number of them. And a lot of the problem was everybody was telling Governor Burgum, well, just listen to the scientists, listen to the experts. Well, the scientists can be myopic. The only part of it they're looking at is the science. They're not looking at the social realities, right? Because there's a cost to implementing some of these policies in terms of business. So it's a dangerous thing. Like we want to put all our eggs in one basket. Like we want to pick the one smart guy in the room or smart gal in the room, as the case may be, and just give them all the authority to make all the decisions. And it doesn't work that way. You can't. There aren't that many people out there, if any, who are capable of that.
No, and certainly a title isn't what makes you an expert. Your education, your experience, your own personal research stuff certainly makes you an expert, and there are credentials that matter. But all
Sure.
of that said, we need to be critical thinkers. We need to be able to put things against, through a filter that includes all the other aspects of a situation, as you talked about, whether it's social, mental health. You can't put everything in a stovepipe and make your decisions, or set something aside over here that's going to have a tremendous impact on everything else. We live in a very dynamic situation, and that's my problem. Frankly, I worry, Rob, a lot about our public school system in this country. That more and more our children are being taught how to think, what to think as opposed to how to think. If you even dare question certain things, you're shunned. If you dare question traditional values, you're shunned. If you dare, question the science of binary, gender, you're somehow a prude, and you need to be shunned. It's really become awful what we've done. Again, it gets back to critical thinking. We are not teaching critical thinking. We're trying to create robots, it appears to me. So I'm really quite concerned about that. I'm very concerned about China. I'm very concerned about Russia, but I'm very concerned about our education system that somehow thinks now you have to be a certain way or else you're not successful. And I've always appreciated the English teacher that would give you an A on a really good paper that articulates a position completely opposite of the teacher's.
Yeah.
And I think we need to get back to more of that.
Well, I was lucky that I had some teachers like that, because trust me, I think by now at this point in my career, people know that I'm not going to pander to anybody.
You don't think some of those teachers are scratching their heads going, well, maybe I should have been harder on them?
There's a couple that I've been in touch with whose politics did not align with my own, and I was joking with some of them, like, you don't look at the monster you've created.
Yeah, it's your fault. Yeah.
But to your point about bringing the smile back, I feel like we need to bring the smile back, not just to conservatism, but to our society. Because one thing, my birthday was yesterday, so I went out to lunch with my daughter and my wife, and we were sitting there, and we were talking about, Layla was talking about, she was learning about the Holocaust at school, and I was talking about, what an important part of history that was. We need to learn about it. But we were also talking about a larger, sort of the larger thing, the topics we choose to study. And sometimes it could seem like we're myopically focused on certain things that happened in history. World War II is a big one. We talk a lot about World War II, and we should talk a lot about World War II. We talk a lot about the civil rights movement and a lot of that. But these are not the only things that happen in society. There's a lot of other very nuanced things that also happen. And one thing that worries me, because we're to your point about what we're teaching in schools, we seem to be teaching this idea that America is somehow uniquely bad in the world, like the 1619 Project, and the idea that America was founded on the idea of slavery. No, it's not. Slavery is a part of our history, and it's terrible. I wish it wasn't so, but it's a part we have to reckon with, and it's a part we have to live with and learn from. And it is a part of our history, but it's also not the only part of our history, and not even the most important part of our history. And so what bothers me is I think kids are coming out of it with this idea that America is this uniquely bad place, and not, as Ronald, recently, Earl Pomeroy was on this live stream with me earlier this week, and that was something we talked about, Ronald Reagan talking about America being the city on the hill. I think in a lot of ways he was saying the same things you were, Kevin, although he was being critical of Donald Trump, saying he's not nearly optimistic enough, which I think you probably disagree with. But I mean, I want to teach that America is a good place again, and I don't think kids are getting that message.
Not at all. That's one of my problems about our education system. I mean, we have standards that are just being adopted and accepted without much of any input from parents. And the World War II agenda, for example, I mean, there are literally standards now, I almost hate the word, education standards, that if you're teaching World War II history, you're required to teach about the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan, but you're not required to teach about Pearl Harbor, for example. And the reason things like that, the only reason I can come up with is that they want to teach that America is bad. We're the enemy. We're the bad people. This, the 1619 Project is a great example of just, it's first of all not true, and second of all, it paints America in a bad light. And even with all of our warts, we're the greatest country, the greatest experiment in the world, and we are a self-governed country, and where self-reliance matters. And I do think that's a little bit of the problem. Marxism is somehow an accepted premise now for a lot of people and organizations. Socialism is actually part of some high-ranking Democratic politicians' platform. I mean, Bernie Sanders is a Democratic socialist, and somehow our children are being taught that that's equivalent to any other form of economy. This is all bad. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't teach some critical elements, or at least point to them and let people decide for themselves. That's not what I'm saying at all. I worry a lot more about what doesn't get taught than what does get taught, because if you leave out certain things, then again, the student or whoever is not given the opportunity to think for themselves critically, but only apply this myopic train of thought. And it's really very frustrating to me. Like I said, it really does concern me.
Well, it's funny because you'll hear a lot of the same people who are, I think, pretty supportive of what the schools are doing, also complaining about the lack of trust that our society has in government, in institutions like the news media, right, in academia. Well, where do you think that lack of trust might come from? If they're coming through a K through 12 system that teaches them that the American government's just this evil thing that was founded on the idea of racism, and we're this evil country, and then they come out and they don't trust, right? Lot of, I mean, you're only telling part of the story.
One of the other institutions I just want to bring up, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, as you know, in the Senate, and we have a lot of these 4-star generals come in front of us, nominees to be secretaries of the various services, the Secretary of Defense himself, and they oftentimes in their opening statements refer to white supremacy, needs to be rooted out of our military, and systemic racism needs to be rooted out. And they say those things because they know that their commander-in-chief that's nominated them or appointed them, or certain senators on the Democratic side of the dais want to hear that. We've started challenging that. And we've started saying, okay, General, you just used the word systemic racism. What study or what data do you have to prove that? Because I know hundreds of military men, and women, and I haven't met a racist among them. Well, they never have any. They never have any evidence that that's true whatsoever. But they've accepted the rhetoric from a political class, and consequently it becomes part of their rhetoric, and pretty soon it becomes part of the training. And what they've done is driven a much, much wider and deeper wedge between people than existed previous to all this.
It reminds me, my father was a Vietnam, is a Vietnam, God, not past it. Yeah. Is a Vietnam veteran. He was a combat veteran, and so that conflict has always interested me. One thing that was very interesting, and I don't think it's uncommon probably of socialist or communist militaries, but their platoons or their regiment, they would have what they called political officers embedded with them that were essentially there, even down to like the platoon level, to essentially enforce the ideology, right? And I worry that when I hear our military talking about, espousing these very political things, it worries me a little bit, because it reminds me of that, where we're going to have like political officers in the military now enforcing an ideology as well as enforcing, discipline and training and all the other things that our military needs to be able to do to protect us and protect our lives and to fight our enemies. That seems to be the way we're going. And that's not me like trying to be like Red Scare, right. We're becoming like the commies or whatever. It's whether it's communism, any ideology. I think if we're at a point where we're embedding political officers, and I look, the city of Fargo just hired a diversity director to come in and he's tasked with doing these studies to find racism. And you find a guy, you hire somebody like that and you task them with finding racism. Of course he's got to find racism, right? If he didn't, he's out of a job. I don't understand, and I'm not saying racism doesn't exist in our society. Of course it does. There's bigoted people out there. I get it, but it's this idea that racism is this inherent systemic thing. I think it's a bunch of hooey. We're humans. We're imperfect and we're flawed, and that's hard. And we've been this way since the dawn of time. And I don't think it's going to change. And our best, what we've got to do is what we've been doing is promoting equitable laws and as much opportunity for everybody as possible. That's what we promote: equality under the law, not this sort of political officer nonsense that we're doing.
Well, Rob, one of the differences between the use of the word equitable and the use of the word equity is that equitable implies an equal outcome. And we accept 1 million legal immigrants a year into the United States. There's nobody that compares.
Equitable, nobody. And when I'm talking about equality of opportunity.
I know what you mean.
Right.
I know what you mean, but I think it's an important distinction to draw because what happens when you accept 1 million immigrants per year legally, and then however many hundreds of thousands come illegally, and Joe Biden thinks there should be 2 million a year, according to his own words. None of them are coming here to seek something worse than they left. But as soon as they get here, somehow there's a whole bunch of people on their behalf, not them necessarily, who want to change America to be more like something else, when the traction is our own exceptionalism, not perfection, but it's exceptionalism. And I think just more of us need to talk about how great America is, and not be running her down all the time.
I agree. Let's pivot just a little bit.
Sure.
You've been pushing this because one manifestation, I think, of what we're talking about is this push in corporate America to sort of embed. Exxon's been making a lot of headlines because they just gave in to some minority. They gave some minority a couple of seats on their board. By the way, far in excess of their actual ownership stake in the company.
Right.
But they got 2 members of the board that are going to promote, environmentalism and a lot of the sort of political stuff that you and I are talking about. Again, it's this concept of sort of embedding political officers to police, a school or a company or whatever. You've been fighting against some of this, like in the banking areas,
right,
saying, because there's been a push to get like during the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, there was a push to get, to really Wells Fargo was a finance, so they were putting a lot of pressure on Wells Fargo to not invest in pipeline companies. You've been fighting something, and not just with energy, but like with gun shops, right? I mean, firearms, a lot of these things that are sort of unpopular with the left. You're fighting it. There was a letter to the editor. It's from a woman named Alma Cook. I guess she runs some sort of a consulting agency out in the oil patch. And she said that it's the right's form of cancel culture when you're pushing this. And this is what her argument was. She says, we call coercion cancel culture when it's a Twitter mob trying to unseat a CEO. We call it authoritarianism when it's the government forcing businesses to bake a wedding cake, shut their doors for 9 months, or, dare I say it, lend to industries they don't want to lend to. Praising freedom of speech in one breath, the senator, referring to you, attacks freedom of association in the next, arguing that banks are too caught up in the culture wars to know a good investment when they see one. So her argument is you're just doing the same thing just from the right side of things that the left side of people are doing. Now, I don't agree with that, but respond to that criticism.
Yeah, so I actually read that piece. And you might not surprise you. I don't read a lot of things that I'm in because there's a lot of it. But that one did catch my attention, and I was interested in reading it. And when I read it, I thought she was arguing with herself, quite honestly, because she presumes that somehow I'm suggesting that banks have to do something. I'm not. What I'm suggesting is they shouldn't not do something just because they feel like it. In other words, they are the ones and their own policies. And if you read them, and I've read them all of these banks, and I'm talking about, Wells Fargo being one of them, but Citigroup, Chase, J.P. Morgan, Chase, obviously, with Jamie Dimon, Goldman Sachs, David Solomon. I've met with all of these people individually. I've introduced legislation, and I've met with them, they testified in the hearing last week. What I'm saying is you can't categorically exclude certain industries because they're the industry. That doesn't mean you have to lend to them if they're not a good credit risk. But remembering, Rob, and this gets back to another similar issue that you and I have disagreed on, that is the role of network television, particularly. When you are backed by the federal government, that is to say the taxpayers of this country, like banks are. Remember, too big to fail. Their insurance is paid for by the taxpayers, so their deposits are protected. You don't have you've given up some of your own personal private sector liberties by accepting these protections by the federal government. And with that in mind, I'm just saying, don't categorically exclude industries. She even used, I think she referenced specifically, abortion clinics or something like that. I've never introduced legislation that says a bank can't lend to any industry. I'm just saying what you can't do is categorically exclude a legal industry.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think it's a tough issue because it is a cultural issue, and I think we're all a little weary of the culture wars. But I mean I think what we have to do is de-escalate from the culture wars, and I think
right.
what we're talking about, where banks aren't going to lend to like, if I want to open a gun shop and I'm going to go to Wells Fargo
Right.
to get a business loan to have the capital to open it, and they're just going to say no because there's a political bias against gun shops, even though it's a lawful business and my business would be profitable. Would be if it was a different type of business, would be a risk the bank would be willing to take. Um, I think that's a fight worth fighting. And again, it's not about I want to force your bank to invest in gun shops. It's that we need to understand that gun shops are not. We're treating it like it's this verboten thing. Like we're treating it
Right.
like gun shops or
Right.
oil companies or whatever. Like they're these taboo things or these unsavory things. Even as everybody's using oil, right? I mean,
Right.
like
Right.
we don't want to invest in the oil. Like I don't want to invest in this oil pipeline, even though I'm going to fly around the country in a plane that's powered by oil. Like you, what is that?
So, yeah. So Rob, here's and I've had great meetings with these bank presidents, Jamie Dimon, David
Well, you
Solomon,
just had a series
Jane
of them, I
Fraser,
saw.
just a series of them, and plus like hearing on. Here's what I think the important point. And this gets back a little bit to our previous conversation as conservatives, and we've talked a lot about activism. What these bank presidents are responding to, it's not their own political view. It may or may not be. It doesn't matter whether it is or it isn't. But in many cases, we know it's not their own view. They've told me it's not their own view. But they're responding to the loudest noise in their ear. And the loudest noise in the ear are activists. And activists are largely liberals. And they form proxies. And so, they get far more influence than they deserve based on how little stock they own in the company, for example. All of that said, it's incumbent upon conservatives, if we have a different view and have any influence over a bank whatsoever, whether it's as a shareholder or as a depositor or just having a checking account, that we also state our views to them. And that's what I've told all of them. I'm going to make sure that there's at least one loud voice in your ear other than those other loud voices, so that you have both an accountability and somebody has your back when you do the right thing. And that's important for all of us. So I will tell you that my conversations have been delightful with these bank presidents. Their ESG statements, their environment, social and governance statements are much harsher, sort of in the translation or the rhetoric than they need to be. But at the end of the day, they want to be part of the solution. So here's what I think we have to offer up. And I've told all of them, if you really believe in bringing down greenhouse gas emissions globally, if you believe that's a high priority and you want your bank to reflect that, invest heavily in the United States of America energy sector. Fossil fuels, renewable fuels, all the above, based on the credit risk. And you'll do a lot more than you will just shutting off coal and oil and gas and transferring all of that supply, meeting the world demand, to Venezuela or Russia or Iran. None of these places develop fossil fuels with the same level of care and environmental stewardship that the United States does. None of them do, not even close in many cases. And so just transferring that somewhere else by saying we're not going to invest in the United States, but letting the Saudis do all the production, or the Iranians, or Vladimir Putin's sure is not going to put that restriction on his banks. It just makes no sense. But again, we have to be engaged, or else they're forced to listen to just one side of the argument all the time and respond to it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And to get back to I guess my analogy or my metaphor with the political officer, I mean maybe that's the point I'm trying to make, is that it seems like politics has invaded everywhere. Now I support, and I know you support, every individual, being able to go about their private lives and their business professional lives in accordance with their in accordance with their convictions, be they political
Right.
or spiritual or what have you.
Yeah.
But the problem is there was a time where we could say, well, it's just business. Like, this oil's a legal product.
Right.
This is a we're all using it. You can't say it's immoral when we're all using it. And I believe this company's a good risk. Our bank's gonna invest in it. This gun shop, guns are a legal product, and until they're not, if this is a company that's going to follow the laws, and I think they're going to be a profitable company, so therefore I'm going to invest in it. Like, we're filtering so many decisions through our politics that it's what's unhealthy to our society. It's why everything's divided. I got flack one time because your opponent ran ads on my blog, Heidi Heitkamp, and everybody was like, "Oh, Rob, you don't like Heidi. Why are you taking her money?" And I said, "I'll take her money. Why on earth would I not take her money?" And by the way, my audience is exactly the audience she probably wants to persuade, because they're not people who like her. She doesn't want to preach to the choir. She should be reaching as a smart thing, I thought. I took it almost as a tacit endorsement of my work. So. I said,
for sure.
why? And she didn't advertise with me directly, I should say, but she ran network ads that ran on my site. But that's what I told people. Like, why on earth wouldn't I? Right? It's a way to make money. I'm a good capitalist. We need more of that in this society. That pragmatism where, I'm willing to work with people I disagree with. I'm willing to work on issues I disagree with.
Well, it's so funny because yesterday we had the EPA administrator in Bismarck.
Yeah, I want to talk about that
before.
Too.
Yeah, so I voted for him in the committee to confirm him. My ranking Republican did not. In fact, not very many Republicans did. I did because, first of all, he's going to be the EPA administrator. Second of all, he's a former state regulator. Third of all, he's got a great personality. He's one of the most likable people you've ever met. And I'd rather have a Democrat nominee by Joe Biden as the EPA administrator that I like than one that I don't like, even if all else is, and everything else we completely disagree. But somebody who's at least willing to come in and listen and has a perspective of states' rights and has a perspective as a former state regulator of federalism. So all of that. So I took a lot of heat for supporting him early on until yesterday when he came to Bismarck and everybody got to meet him. By everybody, I mean all the other, officials and industry folks. And he listened for, several hours yesterday morning to people that he probably might disagree with, but then went away enlightened by the fact that, wow, these people really are innovating. These people really do have some of the answers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and some of the Biden, some of the Biden.
Yeah.
So my point being, to your point, okay. Yeah, there are elections, and sometimes they turn out better for one side than the other, and you may not like the outcome. But then you have to find a way to work within that. And I think the same is true of what I get my coffee at Starbucks. I don't share the political views of the corporate leadership at Starbucks, but I like their coffee. Yeah. So as long as they make the best coffee, I
still, even though a lot of them lately aren't very good, I still buy every book that Stephen King publishes because I've been reading him since I was a kid. I think his politics are obnoxious, and I had to stop following him on Twitter, but I love his books. I think he's a great storyteller. And that gets to a point too where you got to let the other side govern. When I was talking with former Congressman Pomeroy, that was one thing that he and I agreed on was when you lose. He said I think he referred to some fool who had a impeachment bill for Donald Trump in like within days of him being or maybe he wasn't even inaugurated yet. And he said some fool was already trying to impeach him. To the point where when the other side wins, you got to let them govern. Of course, Joe Biden's going to appoint an EPA administrator that you and I don't agree with, right? He won the election. He gets to do that. So we may as well try to find somebody who's friendly and personable that we can at least work with, or at least is going to listen to us before doing the things that we don't like. Although, let's get specific about his trip, because I thought, and you actually toured with him, but I'm just reading the news reporting about it, but I thought he said some very positive things about carbon capture that I think probably some people, even some of our liberal friends right here in North Dakota, who are trying to paint, the carbon capture and Project Tundra as this waste of time and money. I'm reading here. This is from a Bismarck Tribune report. Is his last name Regan or Reagan? I read everything.
He says Regan.
Regan.
Yeah,
Okay.
Regan, yeah.
Okay. So he said that the Biden administration takes a positive viewpoint of carbon capture technology. And here's also what he says. There's no doubt there's huge potential there. Right here in North Dakota, we're seeing leadership. That's a remarkably different tone on carbon capture than we're hearing from a lot of people on the left. I was encouraged by it.
Yeah, as was I, and I wasn't overly surprised by it, Rob, because the administration actually has included carbon capture as one of the technologies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The question becomes: are they going to actually let it mature to the point where it's commercially available? And this is why the trip was so important, because it's one thing to hear about something or read about something. It's quite something else to actually sit across the table with the experts that are doing it. And by that, I mean the folks from the Energy Environmental Research Center, the actual utilities themselves, and to get that sense of confidence about it. And I will tell you this: when I invited him, and he accepted the invitation, of course, right away. And when we sent sort of a menu of choices or of options that he could do, Project Tundra actually piqued their curiosity. He wanted to learn more about that specifically, and he did do that. And so that means he's probably curious enough fellow to dig a little deeper, learn a little more. I had a similar conversation with Secretary Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, just last week. She called me to ask my view of some infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and whether or not I thought that would meet the definition of infrastructure. As you know, we're having this debate over what exactly is infrastructure. And so her and I had a good, long, robust discussion. I happened to be the ranking Republican on the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee. And because I said I'm one Republican that will definitely expand the definition of infrastructure. And clearly anything that moves, products to market, like an oil pipeline, gas pipeline, carbon pipeline, hydrogen pipeline, electric transmission lines, that's infrastructure. The great thing about it is it doesn't require very much, if any, federal investment. It doesn't require any taxes to be increased, doesn't require the debt to be increased. It just requires appropriate regulations that actually provide the right price signals and incentives for private investment. And I said, if you do those things and you have $1 trillion worth of private sector investment in infrastructure for the energy sector, I'll go to the Rose Garden and give Joe Biden credit for it, because we need the infrastructure way more than we need the issue for political reasons. And therein lies the other problem. I think you might have noticed in the story, one of the things I said was that in politics today, there's always has to be a winner or a loser. And I'm saying, no, there could be opportunities where two sides win. They may not win by the biggest score, right?
It's possible.
And we have to think that way.
I think you're right. It's interesting because it so much of the political rhetoric is so binary, right? Where it's wind or it's coal, and although sometimes I think people get a little drippy about the all of the above stuff, at least how it's been applied as policy, because all of the above is not necessarily all equivalent types of energy.
Right.
I do think, there's ways to win here. And we have a resource. We have 800 years of coal. If we can use carbon capture so that we can use that coal, which we know what it does. We know exactly what it is as a resource, what it is as an asset. Why would and we could develop technology that makes it usable in the context of our modern understanding of the climate. Why would we not want to do that? I don't understand. Why, but we've probably talked that one to death. What did you think of Governor Burgum's announcement about North Dakota going carbon neutral by 2030? I thought his rhetoric was good. I support that. I think it's the right thing. I think setting a deadline is a dangerous thing to do in politics, because the tendency is you set a deadline and you make a whole bunch of progress toward that deadline, but maybe you don't hit exactly the thing that you were going for. And then people immediately call it a failure. So like maybe, I don't know, maybe we reduce carbon emissions by like 80% or something, whatever the metric is. But we don't do it by 100%, so we're not carbon neutral, and people, well, it was a failure. So I worry about drawing that sort of a line in the sand. But overall, I think he's striking the right tone. We can do this, and we can do it with innovation and invention in the marketplace and not government regulation. I liked that.
Well, first of all, Governor Burgum's use of the words innovation, not regulation, is more than just a slogan. Although it's a pretty darn good slogan,
Yeah.
but it's always been noble. To your point about picking the year 2030 as the aspirational goal, you're right. It can set you up for failure, but at the same time, I do think there's value in aspirational goals. I think that it'll drives people faster and harder to get there. And if you come up short, rather than being a failure, I would hope we could go look at it and say, okay, so we're not going to make it till 2035. But thanks for setting that ambitious goal. You can always reach low goals. It's easy to get over low bars. So I get that. I do think the challenge, Rob, comes in the communication of it. And that's probably part of the point. If you have the time to flesh out, everything that the governor's saying about it, both the aspirational aspects of it, the innovation and technology aspects of it, and the agricultural aspects of it, because neutrality is different than net zero. So, carbon neutral gets more to the mitigating factors. Whether it's more corn or more planting more trees or credits, which we can argue the financial incentives and the value of credits. I think it's a little bit goofy to pay to pollute, but some of that is gets into the goal of neutrality versus sort of the net zero aspect. They're similar but not always the same. So I guess the point is you just have to spend a lot of time talking about it to get comfortable with an ambition like Governor Burgum has set out. But I don't think it's as alarming as some people maybe have thought it was. I think it's an ambitious goal. Let's get to work.
Let's we got about 15 minutes left. Let's talk about the January 6th commission stuff. Now I know that you oppose the creation of a commission, but I think there's a lot of reasons, and I don't think, as somebody who would very much like a commission, and I think these government commissions can accomplish good things. I thought the 9/11 commission, although had its own problems with partisanship and maybe some gamesmanship, in the aggregate, I think revealed a lot of things about 9/11 that were useful. I feel like we're capable of doing something similar with the January 6th with a January 6th commission. I do think concerns about letting someone like Nancy Pelosi write the rules. I don't think Nancy Pelosi is going to engage in anything like that in good faith. I worry that we are, because to me that was such an important moment for conservatives that we should be learning from, and I worry that the attitude we've developed about it is dismissive, like we just want to sweep it under the rug, pretend like it never happened.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there's been a lot of illustrations and analogies between 9/11 and January 6th. And I think the first thing we have to say is there's no comparison. I mean,
well, no, in terms of events, I was talking about the structure of like an inquiry into it,
I know.
Not that they were comparable events at all.
Right. But also then the urgency or the seriousness of having to have a commission to find out what happened on January 6th, when all of the people that would vote on a commission, vote to have a commission, witnessed the events. I mean, we were all there, quite literally. We've had an impeachment trial over it. We've had a president impeached over it, and we've had a president acquitted. Through through a series of discovery and witnesses and testimony and video evidence, all these things. The other thing you've had is you've had two committees in the United States Senate that have been investigating it. A Senate led by Democrats, but an equally divided committee, and they'll be coming out with their findings here in the next week or two. The House decided not to do that, so Nancy Pelosi declined. But by declining to use the committees of jurisdiction to look into it, in many respects, you sort of have to question how whether she thinks it's just how serious she actually thinks it is, which then makes it political right out of the chute. But really the bigger factor, one of the challenges that the 9/11 Commission did have is that they didn't have a real cooperative Department of Justice. And the reason they didn't is because they were doing their own investigations into it, and they didn't want to share information. They didn't want to share evidence for good reasons. I'm not questioning their reasoning for that. Well, we now have 450 or so investigations going on with 450 arrests, another 100 arrests expected by the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice isn't necessarily going to want to share a lot of information with a sort of third-party commission. for all of those reasons, and the fact that I don't want to say we want to sweep it under the rug, but I do think we want to get it behind us and talk about the things going forward. And some of the things going forward, deal with the security at the Capitol itself. How long do we have to have a fence around the Capitol, for crying out loud? Why do we have so many vacancies in our Capitol Police Department? Yeah. How can we get more officers? How can we make them feel better about their jobs? How can we, and to the degree that the past can inform some of that, I think is really important. But having a commission that's high profile, that's supposed to end its work by the end of this year, which almost certainly would not happen, because they're not going to get the kind of cooperation from the Department of Justice, means that it's going to go on and on and on into perpetuity. I'm exaggerating, but a lot of people would like to keep it alive. I just don't see a real upside to it, Rob. Maybe we'll get there after the findings of all the other investigations come out. If we need to get there, if we need to. If there's more to find out, we can make another decision later. But I just think we ought to be moving forward with what's important in our country right now. We have plenty of important issues to deal with.
Yeah, that was one of the comments you made in the Hill piece that we started this interview talking about, was that I think you referenced like an Italian race car driver who took his rearview mirror off because he always wanted he only wanted to look forward and not in the rearview mirror, which is not a perfect metaphor, because there are, as you mentioned, there are things we need to learn from the past. It does concern me that one of the things that has deeply bothered me about the Trump era, I think, is a willingness to tolerate extremism within the movement, or not be as critical of it or responsive to it as we should be. I think that's a valid criticism of the Trump movement. And what I'm afraid is that by fighting the January 6th commission as Republicans have, maybe I think all the arguments you just made are valid against the commission, but there remains that reality. Perception is reality, and if we're perceived as this, then maybe we're perceived as making excuses for the people who did those awful things on January 6th and did them under Donald Trump's banner. I worry that the message we're sending to them was that was okay, and we've got your back. And I don't want to send that message.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, maybe, but we had an impeachment, for crying out loud, and
we had an impeachment where Republicans opposed impeachment. I mean,
but we also have to remember there are free speech ramifications to all of this stuff. There's association, but there's also direct accountability. We run the risk, I think, in some cases, of taking some people off the hook for their own illegal activity by sort of throwing this banner, as you put it, over the top of it. None of that's an excuse for illegal behavior. Ashley Babbitt's dead, not because anything Donald Trump did, but because of something that she did. And by the way, not because of something that a rogue police officer did, but because of something she did. And so I think we have to keep everything in its proper perspective and its proper context, for sure. But I also think we have to be awfully careful not to overreact either and over dramatize. I think that's some of what's happened with lots of things. I think
9/11. I think is an example where I think some of the things we did post 9/11 with TSA and some of the stuff was security theater, right? Like we're going through the motions, or we're using it as a justification to vastly expand government powers in unnecessary ways. And which is unfortunate, but I do worry. I mean, for instance, just over Memorial Day weekend, we had Michael Flynn, somebody who was briefly, but was a member of Trump's administration. He was talking about. I think he was asked a question about why can't we have a military coup like in Myanmar? Now, he sort of says that he wasn't endorsing a military coup. That's what he's saying now. Right. I think his audio says something different, but I mean, certainly he's advocated on television for saying that we ought to have we ought to do an election re-over and have the military run the election, right? We have a lot of this rhetoric that's happening in the Trump movement under Trump's banner without any condemnation from President Trump. Does that bother you?
Again, Michael Flynn, I've talked to him one time in my life, and I'm glad he walked his statement back or clarified them. I think this is a little bit of the problem we live in the literal world now, where every time somebody says something, we take it literally, we report it literally. They have to walk it back as not being literal. And I'm not I'm not, as you know, I'm not prone to exaggeration myself or to extremism myself. But at the same time, I think, first of all, I appreciate his service. Michael Flynn was greatly abused by Democrats, greatly abused. He was abused by the FBI, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who set a trap for him in the White House, and prosecuted him, and basically forced him to admit to a crime he didn't commit, which he was later pardoned for appropriately. So, if Michael Flynn's a little bit irritated, I guess as a patriot who served this country in the way he did, I guess maybe I'm going to cut him a little bit of slack, but I'm certainly, I just don't want to overreact or over-respond or throw somebody under the bus over something like what we're talking about, a statement, maybe it was a misstatement that he's since walked back.
I don't know. I feel like we might have a different reaction if we were talking about a former Obama cabinet member who was talking about military coups or military run elections.
Well, we should be talking about the current president, who's done more to protect Vladimir Putin, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Has opened up our borders at the southern border. All of these are very, very concerning national security problems that our mainstream media has zero interest in.
But is a distinct thing from having the military run an election because you didn't like the outcome of the last election. I mean, that's a frightening thing that somebody would say that out loud, and just people. I don't want to gloss over stuff like that. That's wrong.
No, I know that, but here we are looking at a bill that has already passed the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives that basically lets social interest groups run elections. The elections aren't run by anybody; they're just wide open, and anybody can vote no matter what, and they can vote. They can collect all that. I mean, we're in a situation, Rob, unfortunately, in this country where we have very extreme conversations about very extreme positions, and I think we have to get back to common ground and compromise where we can, do it with a cheerful demeanor and love for our country as opposed to political personalities.
I want that too. I worry what the public's actual appetite is for that sort of thing, but I guess
I do too. You raise a good point. I mean, that's part of the problem, right? We are a reflection of the public, and I often say that, but we have a two-way responsibility, right? And we have to be both a reflection of the public, and then we have to use forums like this to help influence the public when it's necessary. Well, and Kevin, not be afraid of that.
I appreciate your time as always. Our hour together is up, so we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.
Thanks, Rob. Always my pleasure. Bye-bye.